With me now is Sabrina Singh, National Press Secretary for Cory Booker's campaign. Sabrina, nice to see you again. All right. In many ways, the Biden campaign has almost been taunting your campaign. Okay, if you want to come after us, come after us. What is Senator Booker's plan for tonight?
You know, I think our biggest strategy tonight is to let Cory be Cory. We have to let him be himself. We have to introduce him to the voters that are just tuning in for the first time. And part of the reason why I love working for Cory Booker so much is that he is so authentic and so real. And so that's what we really have to showcase tonight. The Biden campaign might be trying to taunt us and sort of showcasing their strategy on how they plan to push back. But we, at the end of the day, want Cory to be himself out there. And if there comes a moment where there needs to be some real truth spoken, I have no doubt Cory Booker will do that tonight on the debate stage.
You know, on these issues, on these various issues related to race, whether we're talking about the 94 crime bill, perhaps Senator Biden's record, the Biden campaign pushes back and says, hey, wait a minute, we want to have this debate about race. How do you have criticize each other on some racial issues in the midst of Donald Trump in the White House? Is it awkward to have this intramural fight when you have Donald Trump in the White House? What do you say to that?
You know, I mean, just because Donald Trump is in the White House does not mean that Democrats should not debate the issues that Donald Trump, in fact, is bringing up himself. I mean, this is a very racially charged environment. We have Donald Trump criticizing, the 4 congresswomen to Elijah Cummings just as recently, I think, as yesterday. This is in a racially charged environment that Donald Trump has created. And so the issue of race is so important to talk about right now, and how Democrats are going to handle the issue of race if they were to be elected president. And I think we have to remember, there is severe racial and wealth income inequalities in this country. And part of that is because of the 1994 crime bill that, really did separate and tear apart so many communities in this country. And so I think records are fair game and on the table. But I also think, we are looking for, as a country, someone to heal our wounds. And through common pain is common purpose. That is also something that Cory says constantly. And so tonight, I think he's really going to make that case clear of why he is the best person to defeat Donald Trump.
One of the things I hear from some progressive activists about Cory Booker is that he talks like a progressive, but he governs too much like a centrist or too much like a moderate or whatever word you want to use that the progressive might think is disparaging of somebody that's not a progressive. What does Senator Booker say to that criticism?
I mean, I think he wouldn't even address that criticism. Cory governs the way he is. Cory, he governs the right way. He believes in fighting for all. This is about restoring justice to our system, to our country. And from the time as mayor to the time that he's been in Congress and the Senate, he is someone that has consistently fought for those communities that were left behind. And that is why he is running for president. He is the only candidate on that stage that lives in a low-income environment. That informs his worldview. That informs the policies he brings to the table. And that really informs, how he's going to approach being president of the United States. We cannot forget about the black and brown communities that have been left behind, not just under this presidency, but, others before us. And as Cory has said before, Donald Trump is the floor. He is not the ceiling. We can do better. And that is why Cory Booker is running.
Sabrina Singh, a national spokesperson there for the Booker campaign. Good to see you. Thanks for coming on and sharing your and the senator's views. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.